So do you think racial politics or the politics of race, that will be the ultimate determinant in this election? It wasn't in 2018. Do you think it will be this time round?
I think the politics of race, I think, again, like people sort of set that aside a little bit in 2018 because 1MDB was the issue, but not entirely, right? Because
correct.
Also, you know, they said that if Mahathir wasn't around in, and if Bersatu wasn't around as part of the coalition in PH in 2018, then PH would never have won, right? They would never have formed federal government in the first place.
Yeah.
Racial politics, yes, to a certain extent. I think it's here to stay. It will be, you cannot avoid it. The paintbrush of race is everywhere. In Malaysia, it colors everything. It colors the way all political parties are campaigning, how they're doing their strategizing, their messaging, their analysis even. But I think that's not enough. So I think any, you know, more sophisticated like analyst has to take that into consideration, but it's not the end all and be all factor. Because if it were, then what accounts for the differences in the ways in which voters are choosing between Barisan Nasional, Perikatan Nasional, and Pejuang? Right? You have like 3 very Malay Muslim parties. All of them stand for Malay Muslim unity. They are all, you know, rather conservative to a certain extent. And there are very clear differences in the way that voters are going to choose for these 3 different parties. And so I think being able to separate between the preferences here is very difficult though. I mean, it requires like a more layered understanding of Malay society, which I think is also a good thing because Malay society cannot be viewed as being homogeneous either. I think sometimes there's an assumption, especially from non-Malays, right, to just say, okay, you know, who are the Malay voters? Like, what do the Malay voters want? Look, the Malay voters are as human as any of us. We have multiple preferences, and I think, you know, researchers also need to be able to appreciate the subtle differences between the different communities and be able to segment them according to the more psychographic ways, you know, ways in which that companies and marketers have done for time immemorial. And then we'll really be able to understand like what is the pulse and the heart and the beating heart of the Malay community. There's urban, rural. I mean, it's not just urban, rural, but it's about languages. And don't forget like urbanization plus media, exposure to different culture. I think this is also transforming the way in which we are thinking and voting in the present and future.
There's a question here by Chun Hao. So is it possible for race-based politics to transform into class-based politics in the future? I mean, it's not an either or, of course, but more of class-based rather than race-based politics. Do you think it's possible? In the near future, at least?
Yeah, I think we do need to think about class. That's unavoidable. I mean, so most of the surveys and the opinion polls that you see will sort of use like urban and rural as a sort of proxy for class. I mean, that's not actually very accurate, but it is a proxy in a way. And so, yes, analysts will also look at, you know, what's the difference between the urban and the rural vote, assuming that the rural vote, you know, requires there's a certain set of needs from among the rural vote versus among the urban vote. I mean, we need to be able to like do cross-cutting analysis, right? So it's about race, it's about class, it's about you know, like I use this term psychographic. It's what the marketing people use because it segments not just by so age as well, right? Age and then also language. So it's not just enough to talk about race, but it's about what language they speak. So in the commercial world, for example, they will find that the English-speaking Malays and the English-speaking Chinese within a certain geographic region actually share a lot more in common with each other than, for example, the Malay-speaking Malay and the English-speaking Malay, or the Chinese-speaking Chinese and the English-speaking Chinese. So all that to say that, for example, like myself, who I would consider myself an English-speaking Chinese, I don't speak Chinese per se, I have a lot more in common, in my voting trends, my voting patterns would be much more similar to my colleague who's English-speaking Malay compared to a Chinese-speaking Chinese. So I think it's true that race analysis can be rather sweeping, and it doesn't give you that layered approach. So language is important, language, race, class, not just class, but specifically income levels, a level of education, age. All these are multiple factors that one would need to consider. So I think people do tend to be quite superficial when we just talk about race as a single factor.